Okay, well, I'll get started with my little introduction here. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this special webinar as part of the Invasive Species Center's webinar series. My name is Madison Sturba, and I'm a Program Development Coordinator at the Invasive Species Center, and I'll be your moderator for today's question and answer session. Before we begin, I just wanted to acknowledge that the Invasive Species Center honors the long history of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Nation people on the lands now known as Canada and strives to show respect to their ancestors, their communities, and to them individually. Since we're meeting virtually, I wanted to acknowledge that the Indigenous peoples are the traditional stewards of the lands and waters where each of us attends this morning's webinar. The purpose of today's webinar is to answer some frequently asked questions about oak wilt and the new detection. I imagine most of you already know a little bit about oak wilt already, so I'll keep my intro very short and brief. But just as a refresher, oak wilt is an invasive fungal pathogen that spreads in the vascular system of oak trees. It's a threat to all oak trees, but red oaks are particularly vulnerable and can die in a single season. Red oaks are quite popular throughout backyards, parks, streets, and forests in Ontario. These beautiful trees support biodiversity by providing food and habitat to wildlife. Oak trees have direct economic benefits to Canada since their strength and durability makes them commercially valuable, but they also provide indirect economic benefits too through essential ecosystem services like air filtration and carbon sequestration. So overall, the loss of oaks will have economic, ecological, and social consequences with major impacts on Canada's natural resources and forest industries. But all that being said, there are experts who are working on solutions to try and prevent the loss of these trees and to mitigate those negative impacts. So we'll meet some of those experts now. We have three wonderful oak wilt experts here who can tell us more about the disease and the status here in Canada. So our first panelist is Nicole Malechek. As a plant health survey biologist for Ontario, she develops and oversees surveys to detect or delimit populations of invasive pests. She enjoys the many opportunities to collaborate with a wide variety of people to research and promote plant health issues such as oak wilt. We also have Dr. Sharon Reed with us, who is the Forest Health Resource Scientist for the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. She's been working with numerous partners in Ontario and across Canada and the United States to help develop best management practices for oak wilt that are specific to Canada. And Charlie Smith is our third panelist today. He is an ISA certified arborist and graduate from Fleming College. Charlie started with the forestry department at the city of Niagara Falls in 2002 as a tree climber and has worked his way up to the forestry supervisor. Charlie's years of working in trees has given him a passion about the conservation and preservation of trees for future generations. So thank you all so much for being here. I'll stop sharing my screen and we will get into our Q&A session. So I do have a list of questions that we'll go through that were already submitted to us. So we'll start with those and then we'll get to audience questions at the end if there's time. So if anyone in the audience has questions for our panelists, please submit them in the Q&A box and I'll read them aloud at the end. And then just a note for our panelists, I'll direct a question at one or two of you at a time, but just feel free to jump in anytime if you have something to add. Okay, so our first question here is for Nicole. What is the current status of oak wilt in Canada?
Thanks, Maddie. So there have been two detections of oak wilt in Canada, one in a residential neighborhood in the city of Niagara Falls and one in a residential neighborhood in the township of Springwater. For those of you who don't know, Springwater is just northeast of Barrie.
Beautiful. So for Nicole and Charlie, the first detection, like you said, of oak wilt was found in Niagara Falls. How was this discovery made and what sort of response has there been?
Charlie, I can begin by going over how the discovery has been made, and you've played a huge part in all of the response. So I'll let you tackle that part of the question. So on May 23rd, the CFIA was contacted by the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters, who received a report from an arborist in Niagara Falls that had been contacted to provide a quote on the removal of 3 dead oak trees. The arborist recognized the signs and symptoms of oak wilt and forwarded it on to us. CFIA followed up on site and collected samples and has since confirmed the presence of oak wilt. Since that point, there have been a lot of efforts by quite a few groups together, one of them being City of Niagara Falls. So I'll let Charlie tackle the response.
Thanks, Nicole. So after we were on site sampling the trees, we put a plan together to remove the trees and dispose of all the material. We did that through the homeowner's contractor with the services she had contracted. We just oversaw the work to make sure that all the sanitation of tools and equipment was followed, and then that the disposal of the material was in fact disposed of properly, and we did use a deep burial disposal method on that. Took us about a day and a half. That included stumping and restoration of the stumps. all that material was removed as well. So it went smooth. Everything was good. And that's what we did.
And I can just add on and say, although the City of Niagara Falls did put together a lot of this and coordinate it, CFIA does have to oversee all removal and disposal activities. And after these are complete, CFIA continues to monitor the area to ensure that we've removed these trees and detect any additional signs and symptoms of oak wilt. So with any detection that we may have, monitoring does take place in the area as part of the response.
Awesome, thank you, Sue. So as a follow-up to the two of you, what are the next steps for the City of Niagara Falls and for Ontario in general?
So Nicole, I'll go first this time. So we've continued to monitor the city for oak wilt. We've scanned pretty much the whole city twice. The ground zero area, we've done a 1.6 kilometer area around ground zero that we've gone through twice. We haven't found any additional sites yet, but we do have 3 locations that we are monitoring quite regularly. We're also planning to do another sweep through maybe some of our woodlots this winter if we get a chance to get through when there's a lot of leaves off the trees, off the lower forest area, I guess. And we'll see if we can find anything through some of our woodlots and our wooded trails. And then we've also continued to eliminate all pruning and removals other than the winter season. So we don't prune, we don't do anything like that until the winter season. Anything you want to
Yeah, so the City of Niagara Falls is doing a lot of work in monitoring a lot of their municipal trees, and CFIA can handle the residential trees. Under the Plant Protection Act and regulations, we do have the authority to work on the residential properties. So we're going door to door, and we are working with residents to be able to survey those trees. As well, the CFIA is working with various experts to help inform additional next steps. And a pre-established oak wilt technical advisory committee comprised of municipal, provincial, and federal partners has been convened to discuss additional response options. And I really want to emphasize that no matter what the situation is, outreach and communication is very important to any response. So between City of Niagara Falls and Charlie supporting all the messaging that CFIA is putting out, the Invasive Species Center hosting this webinar, and CFIA putting out their own messaging, we're trying to get as much information about oak wilt out as possible so that people like you who are attending this webinar, if you see signs or symptoms, you can send them our way for follow-up.
Wonderful, that's really great information. So this next question is for Nicole and Sharon. Where might we expect to see oak wilt next, and what is the most likely pathway of spread?
Do you want to go first, Sharon, and explain the pathways of spread and a bit more of the biology of the pest?
All right. So, and this will answer one of the questions that was already posted, was that the fungus can be transmitted by beetles. And so like this fungus is sweet smelling, and the beetles are attracted to the sweet smell of the fungus. And the beetles are unfortunately also attracted to oak wounds. So that is one pathway of spread. And then the disease also spreads below ground through connected root systems. So that's just a bit about the biology and how the disease spreads. And the research suggests that the climate in southern Ontario, especially the warmer portions of southern Ontario, that area is already suitable for oak wilt to develop. And regardless of the temperatures, by 2050 or mid-century, all of Ontario throughout the range of oaks would be suitable for oak wilt. So taking that in mind is really important to remember, what are the spread pathways. So one of the big ones that we really easily can avoid is avoiding the moving of firewood. So any place that has firewood being introduced to it is going to be a high risk. So campgrounds, parks where firewood's being brought into, homes that are buying firewood and bringing it home. Those are all going to be high risk areas. Also, places where logs are stored can be a high risk area. And we would also consider like areas along the border to be high risk because beetles can be blown by wind, by storms across the border, and those beetles may have the fungus on them.
That was a great answer, Sharon, and I don't have anything to add to it. You covered off really well how the disease can spread. The only thing I'll note is that because human-mediated movement of things that could harbor the fungus and the beetles, so logs and firewood, we can't truly predict how that will be. We don't know where everyone lives and where their cottage is or where they're going camping. So we can't really predict the next area of risk for oak wilt. As Sharon mentioned, all of Ontario is climatically suitable for it. So all we can do is really emphasize not to move oak logs or firewood, especially during a high risk period for the transmission of oak wilt, which we'll discuss a little later, but we do recommend against pruning trees between April and the end of October.
Awesome, good to know, thank you. So question for you, Nicole. What is the prognosis for oak in Ontario, especially using emerald ash borer and Dutch elm disease as benchmarks?
So oak wilt is a slow-moving disease when it spreads naturally. The root grafting is only able to happen, with roots that are adjoining, and aside from major wind events that blow the beetle vectors that could harbor the fungus, those beetles have really only been able to move, about 1.6 kilometers. As well, Canada has been preparing for oak wilt for many years, especially considering how close some of the US infestations are. We have a response framework for Canada and a team of experts and many interested parties who are all available to support active management of this pest. And we've really mobilized very quickly, especially with the Niagara Falls detection. So we have a strong foundation to continue this response.
That's great, thank you. And another question for you here, Nicole. What are the management options for oak wilt in Canada?
So I do want to begin by saying that there's no cure for oak wilt. If trees are found to be infected, they will have to be cut down to prevent spread, and the root system can still remain viable for spread through root grafting. So we have to ensure no trees are nearby to allow for root grafting. The oak wilt response framework, which is publicly available, goes over a few management options. And depending on where oak wilt is detected, it could inform which management options are used. I do recommend, if you're interested, if you're an arborist or you work with a municipality, to check out the oak wilt response framework for Canada. It is a great resource and might help inform next steps or help you prepare if you're concerned about oak wilt coming to your area. Briefly though, a few management options that are mentioned in this framework include root disruption to prevent root grafting, tree removal, as I mentioned, regulatory control by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. So this includes things like prohibitions of movement, which is a regulatory form that restricts the movement of materials that could harbor and spread oak wilt, delineation of infested areas, and then subsequent site monitoring.
Awesome, thank you. Question for you, Sharon. What should we be looking for when monitoring oak trees? And are there any disease lookalikes we should be aware of?
Okay, so oak wilt, this behaves a little differently in trees in the red oak group than in the white oak group. So I'm going to make that distinction first off. So common symptoms would be early rapid leaf drop from the top down of the crown. Also, the leaves have a dieback pattern where it starts at the tip of the leaf and then moves down towards the base. Some of the signs that you may see would be the cracks that form in the bark of the tree when the fungal pressure pad is pushing outwards. And also you can see the pressure pads themselves under those bark cracks. The red oaks, they're far more susceptible to this disease. So you're going to see this, the entire crown wilt. It could happen over a couple of weeks. It might take a month. But white oaks, it's a lot harder to identify the symptoms. So your white oak, your bur oak, they are more capable of walling off the infection. And so you can get more like an oak decline type symptoms where you have branches dying back in the top of the tree instead of the entire tree crown wilting in a short period of time. So saying that, I kind of talked to some of my colleagues in the Midwest because, this year we've just been bombarded with a lot of reports of possible oak wilt. And so they said that the thing that they look for the most is that early rapid leaf drop from the top down in the red oaks. And that, that's for them, it usually occurs in July because that's when things kind of start getting hot and dry. This year, we had this this period of dryness that developed earlier in the season. So obviously, like late May and June, we were already seeing that wilt that was occurring. So that's the general advice on, separating out what is an oak wilt infected tree versus all of these other declines and infections and abiotic stressors on oak trees. There's a little question, the question also asks, what are disease lookalikes? So this year, a lot of the reports were from the frost damage that we had earlier in the season. And then, so, that's abiotic. It's going to be widespread on oaks throughout the landscape. Whereas oak wilt, it's a slow moving disease. You're going to find maybe a pocket of oak wilt where there's a couple of trees, the dead one in the longest dead ones in the center with the declining trees along the outside edge. But you're not going to see like all of a sudden an entire stand of oaks, infected with oak wilt. So if you're seeing widespread symptoms, it's more likely that you're seeing abiotic type damage to those trees.
Awesome, that's great.
Yeah, go ahead. I was just going to say that one thing with the white oak groups, since those trees are a little bit harder to, see the obvious symptoms, taking down a branch sample ideally outside of the height of the risk period to look for stainless sapwood is advisable.
Can I also interject here and just ask if Sharon can give an overview of, the disease progression? So when you see the bronzing and then leaf drop, and then when the bark cracks and fungal pads might be evident.
Thanks, Nicole. So for sure, that for a red oak tree that wilts, you're going to see that in the summer, like we were talking about earlier, when it starts getting dry. Usually, and but the pressure pads don't really develop until the above ground parts of the tree have died. So fall, when usually it's getting a little bit of moisture again, or in the spring, that's when you'll see the pressure pads develop, and then the bark will crack. And then that crack allows the beetles to crawl down in and become contaminated with the fungal spores and restart the cycle.
Good to know. Thank you. Yeah, great question, Nicole. Question for you, Nicole, next. Where can landowners get more information? Are there any places online where someone can find certified arborists in their area?
So the Canadian Food Inspection Agency's landing page on oak wilt is a great place to start. This has a fact sheet as well as a link to the response framework that I was speaking about earlier. It has images of signs and symptoms and a link to report signs and symptoms of oak wilt. If I haven't said it, already, I will say it a few more times throughout this webinar. If you suspect oak wilt, please report it to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. Please do not try to take your own sample, especially during this high risk period. If it is suspect for oak wilt, we will send inspectors to the location, and they'll be able to take a controlled sample and submit it to our lab for verification. I do also want to put a plug in here for the Invasive Species Center. They have a lot of great resources, and I might turn it to Maddie right now to describe a few of those and how to find them.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. I see people popping in some links in the chat too, so thank you for that. But yes, the Invasive Species Center has lots of different resources on our website, many of which are completely free to access. So we do have an oak wilt species profile, and that outlines oak wilt biology, spread, management, and more. And that profile kind of acts like a hub of information. We do have other resources linked in that profile. So we have fact sheets in English and French. We have an eDNA FAQ page and a municipal prevention checklist, all available for download. You can also sign up for our quarterly newsletter called the Oak Wilt Wire. So this newsletter provides up-to-date information on all things oak wilt. So any kind of new news, research, findings, distribution, all that kind of stuff. Hopefully there aren't any more detections, but if there are, we'll be sharing updates through this newsletter within 24 hours of CFIA confirmation. The ISC has also been doing a lot of, oh, sorry, Nicole, were you going to jump in there?
I was just going to note that at the top of your profile page as well, you have a link to CFIA's website where you can report a pest. That will be really valuable, as I find many people like using the Invasive Species Center website, but it still links us together.
Perfect. Yes, thank you for pointing that out. Definitely use that link. But yeah, we've also been doing a lot of training at the ISC. So we have a virtual self-paced oak wilt training course, and we offer that through our training program. It's just a big deep dive into oak wilt. And we have updated it to reflect the current news, the current distribution. We also offer customized training sessions in the form of webinars or workshops. So we're actually hosting a workshop in July for municipal conservation and forest industry staff for people that are in the areas that are currently affected by oak wilt, and we'll plan to host another one later in the year in Windsor. So we're always open to collaborating, and if you're interested in training, just let us know. And the final thing I'll say about ISC resources is that this webinar will be recorded and available on our YouTube channel, and so it can be accessed anytime. And I'll be linking all of these resources in the follow-up email that you'll get tomorrow. So just check in for your inbox and you can get all those. And then just in terms of where you can possibly find certified arborists in your area, I think the International Society of Arboriculture would be a great place to start. They have an Ontario chapter, so I'm sure they could get you in touch with some experts in your area. But okay, so we'll move on to the next question here. For Sharon and Nicole, what can we do to help prevent the spread as community members and landowners?
So I can start with, CFIA's message, and Sharon can jump in. As she and I have both already mentioned, the high risk period is from April until about the end of October. I'll let Sharon speak more to the science of that. So we're asking that you avoid pruning or wounding your oak trees during this time. Do not move any firewood and do not move any oak logs. We're also asking that people understand and know the signs and symptoms of oak wilt, keep an eye out for those, and report any suspects to the CFIA as soon as possible so that we can follow up. Sharon?
All right. So I think that maybe, Nicole, what you wanted me to speak to. So if you want to avoid oak wilt at all costs, do not prune your oak trees between April and October. You'll see in the states that there is a differentiation between the high risk period and a low risk period. So I'll talk a little bit more later about the research I'm doing, looking at, an absolute high risk period, which is more towards the beginning of the growing season, when the beetles are most active. But I think at this point in time for Ontario, since we're in this phase of eradication, that we're really looking for no risk. And so that no risk is April to July 31st. And I think that's something, I don't think this was mentioned, but if a tree is wounded during risk period, especially the beginning of the growing season, you can paint those wounds to protect them. It is not something that we would normally advise because painting wounds can increase the risk of stem rot or branch rot. But if your choice is between having oak wilt versus the possibility of having a stem rot, I think most people would choose to avoid oak wilts.
Perfect, thank you. Question for you, Sharon. Are there any preventative treatments that can be applied to oak trees to protect them from oak wilt?
Okay, so I think I just mentioned that you can paint wounds if it's during this risk period. But, you know, once a tree has oak wilt, there's no cure. So avoiding damaging the oaks during the high risk period is, you know, the best policy you can have. There are some chemicals that are offered in the States, like propiconazole, which is a fungicide, but these chemicals only slow the death of trees and they're expensive, so they're only used for high value oak trees. But those products are not available in Canada at this time.
Good to know, thank you. Nicole, where can people report possible oak wilt sightings? I know you mentioned it. Is there a specific email or just through the website?
There is a specific email that we have that receives all oak wilt reports, and I can throw that into the chat or perhaps have Lauren Rogers throw that into the chat so everyone has access to it. However, when you go to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency's contact page, any information that you send to that email address there will end up coming to the oak wilt reporting page anyways. As well, many of our partners do know of this oak wilt reporting email account, and they are aware that all reports ultimately do need to come to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency as soon as possible. So while we do recommend immediately sending all reports to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, if you're unable to find this contact page, as Maddie and I mentioned earlier, the Invasive Species Center has a link to it as well.
Perfect. Sharon, what research is currently underway on oak wilt in Canada?
Right. So the program that I've been directing has been working on oak wilt related subjects for the last 5 years with the goal of identifying best management practices. So the first thing that we've started working on was identifying which beetles would be the vectors of oak wilt in Canada. We worked with partners at Natural Resources Canada and Manitoba and in Southern Ontario to identify 11 species of sap beetles that visit trees in the red and the white oak group, visit the wounds specifically. And the good news was that only 3 of those species regularly visit these types of oak trees. So that means that we can target our best management practices to those beetles. Unfortunately, we did find that those beetles are widespread throughout the range of oaks in the eastern half of Canada. So that makes it, there is a potential for oak wilt to occur anywhere as the climate becomes more suitable for that. The research we're doing now is more targeted to identifying the time of year that these beetles are most likely to visit oak wounds. We have found that they start flying early in the spring before the buds start swelling, but they don't actually start visiting oak wounds until leaf out. But that research is in early stages still, and we're still repeating that study. One of the things that we've been doing with the detections around the city of Niagara and in Springwater is we put out beetle traps, and we are going to be testing the dead beetles for DNA of the fungus. So we have a better understanding of which beetles are visiting the fungal pads here in Canada as well. I also wanted to point out that there's been some research by Philip Tanguay and Guillaume Bilodeau, Natural Resources Canada and CFIA, to develop detection techniques for the fungus, to identify beetles using molecular testing, and with the hopes of doing more biosurveillance using environmental DNA. And then also Natural Resources Canada did a climate study a few years back, as well as an economic analysis.
Good to know. Yeah, lots of great research going on. Thank you. So the last of my questions here that I prepared is for Charlie and Nicole. What recommendations can you give other municipalities to help prepare for oak wilt?
Do you want to go first, Charlie?
So first off, I would say start educating staff about proper pruning and the timing of pruning, and also start to look for signs and symptoms of oak wilt. The timing of it is essential, especially this time of year when guys, there's crews outside trimming around trees and stuff like that, making sure that they're staying away from the base of the trees with their trimmers, not causing damage to any oak trees. That would be essential right now. If you can assign staff to monitoring and documenting all your oak trees, if you come across something that you suspect might have oak wilt, take a picture of it, check it out again a week later, and if it's continuing to decline, then contact FIA. And some communication with surrounding municipalities. We're all going to be in the same boat when it comes to oak wilt. It's not gonna stop at a border, a city border, or anything like that. It's just gonna carry on. And the last thing I would seriously recommend is start giving some thought into the resources that you have available to you. If you do end up with an infection in your city, what kind of disposal methods can you do? Do you have equipment? Do you have staff? What are your contractors able to do for you? Local arborists. We had a local arborist here in Niagara Falls that found it. Great. It was great that they did that, that they were aware of that. So it's good to have open communication with all those people. Anything else, Nicole?
That covered nearly all the points that I had prepared. To add on to one of them, what CFIA will ask for after an oak wilt detection is an up-to-date tree inventory. That will help us guide our follow-up activities, get an idea of the spread of oaks throughout the city, as well using your media to educate your city members of the public on the risk of oak wilt. Not all people end up attending webinars like this, and if you have a few other channels that you can put out oak wilt information, even just on what the signs and symptoms are and where to report and what not to do during the high risk period, that will help a lot. Otherwise, Charlie, you answered that very well.
Nicole, one other thing I forgot to mention is really should familiarize yourself with the CFI response framework. Just have a glance through that, read through it. Lots of good information there, and can give you some good insight into what to expect if you do end up happening.
That's actually a really great point and jogged my memory on something as well. We've had a few individuals like neighboring cities contact the CFIA already for a lot of these resources as they want to be proactive and start developing their own response plans. So a lot of the resources that we've discussed already, which I believe Lauren Rogers has put in the chat, they will be really valuable in starting response plans. So the response framework is an amazing place to start. It has a lot of great information and it's written quite simply as well. So it's very easy to adapt that to your own particular situation, whatever your city or township is like.
That's really great advice. Thank you all so much. Okay, so that was it for my preset list here of questions. We'll move on into audience questions now. I'll try and go back and forth between the Q&A and chat box, but if folks could please move their questions into the Q&A box, that would just be a little bit easier for me, but I will try to get to all the different questions here. Okay, so the first question here was already kind of answered, so I might try and adapt it a little bit. This person asks, are there any injectable fungicides available in Canada? I know you said there weren't right now. Is there any plans that you know of to try and get those registered here in Canada?
So there has been some interest expressed in potential emergency registration. So that is something that is being looked into, but at this point, there's nothing available.
Why is the trimming restriction April to August when in other areas it's recommended to prune in the middle of summer, like in late July or August, and the middle of winter to decrease chance of bug transmission?
I can start by answering that, and then I might turn to Sharon to either emphasize anything that I said or add additional information. So prior to detections of oak wilt in Canada, the general high risk period was seen as April to August. But now that we have oak wilt in Canada and we are trying to determine exactly, if there's additional populations or if these two that we've identified are the only ones, we are working out of an abundance of caution to truly reduce the risk of additional spread. So that's why our messaging going forward from CFIA is for not to prune or wound oak trees from April until the end of October. Anything to add, Sharon?
Yeah, I just re-emphasize, so our research does suggest that there is a high risk period early in the season based on two of the beetle vectors, but low, the rest of the period, it's not like it's a no risk period, it's a low risk, right? So less chance of infection, but still the chance of infection. And this managing for oak wilt is such a time consuming and cost prohibitive operation. Really, I would just really suggest adopting this no risk, at least for now, until we have a better understanding of what's going on.
So thank you. This next question is probably for you, Nicole. Do you have any ideas how the disease was introduced into Niagara Falls and the Barrie area in the first place?
Those are great questions. And if I'm honest, they've been keeping me up at night over the past few weeks. As Sharon and I have discussed a few of the pathways of spread already. And if you consider how close Niagara Falls is to the nearest detection, it's unlikely that a beetle flew over. So we can take some guesses, but at this point, we don't really have enough information to say for certain what introduced oak wilt into Niagara Falls and then up to Barrie. We do really want to emphasize the messaging not to move firewood or other oak products to prevent any further spread.
Awesome. So can you give a little more information about the deep burial method? How does this keep the fungus from moving through the soil?
I can start and explain how that is one of CFIA's approved disposal methods, and Sharon might be able to add on the biology of the pest. So oak wilt does need a live oak tree to be able to move through. And when the tree has been cut up and deep buried, it prevents the roots from continuing to grow and spread and use root grafting. As well, it prevents the oak wilt beetle vectors from getting to the live wood material. Did I do a good job with that, Sharon, or do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, just the fungus passes through the actual physical tree roots and not out into the soil. So it's not going to spread out from those buried roots or buried, logs and stuff. So.
I do want to add that, we're recommending deep burial at official landfill sites because we don't want any oak trees planted right on top and have the roots get to any of the oak material. But as Sharon said, the pathogen doesn't move through the soil. It needs to actively move through live root systems.
Right. Okay. So this next question kind of relates to this. Could the disease be spread through wood chips used as mulch?
In the response framework, it does mention that chipping is an approved disinfection method. Like I mentioned, needs live wood material. We have had some questions on if the beetle vectors are still attracted to the wood chips. And I believe the science states that the wood chips dry out rather quickly and they no longer become attractive to the beetle, to the wood material. However, we are not recommending that those wood chips then be used as mulch around garden beds. That material as well, we do recommend gets moved to a landfill site, again, out of an abundance of caution.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you. So this person's question here, if we come across oak wilt in an area such as the beaches of Toronto with very little area to work with, will a disposal or secondary site be in place for material handling during the growing season? There would be an inadequate area on site to store a mature tree until the appropriate time to dispose of the material within the regulations for disposal of oak wilt material.
I think that's me again. So I do want to note that depending on, the state of the tree when you identify it, that will impact when the tree gets removed. For example, the trees in Niagara Falls, they had the bark cracks and we could actively see those fungal mats. And we're in the time period where these beetle vectors that Sharon was speaking about are actively flying and could fly to other potentially wounded oak trees and spread the pathogen. So for that reason, those 3 trees did have to come down immediately. In the case of Springwater, the tree was identified based on the leaf symptoms and no bark cracks or fungal mats were found. So we did not order tree removal immediately. And instead, right now, we're focusing on delimitation surveys, and tree removal will begin in the low risk period. For all products that are all the wood during removal process, CFIA will work with the municipality and the contracted arborist to determine the best removal and disposal method. Perhaps Charlie can speak more about why they end up going with the methods that they went with. But throughout the response framework, we give a few options on how to dispose. We do just recommend that whatever removal option you choose is the most efficient time-wise, because we do not want open wounds on these oak trees over like a week-long period.
Thanks, Nicole. So the reason why we chose to go with the deep burial method is because the trees were very large. They were 80, 90 foot red oaks. The one was about 70 inches DBH. So it was a very large tree. We did source out and look at the option of bringing in a large chipper to chip everything, but then we were still going to have to do a deep burial on the wood chips. So it made more sense for us to just bring the trees over the house with a crane, load them all into trucks, seal the trucks up with tarps, and transport it to the landfill and have it buried that way. Either way would have been fine from a standpoint of the end result being buried, but it just made more sense for us to go ahead and just remove the tree and bury it as whole pieces as opposed to chipping it and paying for the disposal fee as well.
Sounds good, thank you. So this question here, how susceptible are young trees to oak wilt? Would smaller nursery stock of less than 2 meters tall be just as vulnerable to infection through pruning as mature trees?
Oak wilt can infect any size and age of tree. I think that answers the question pretty well. It's not restrictive to beautiful mature trees or young small trees.
Perfect. Yes, thank you. Let me see here. This is going to be for you, Nicole. Are there zones established by CFIA with each discovery in terms of future monitoring? If so, what are the size of the zones?
So we're still working on our long-term response plan at this point, as we were really focused on tree removal for that high-risk site in Niagara Falls and the immediate delimitation survey. At this point, all activities and door-to-door surveys and surveying all oak trees is taking place within 1.6 kilometers of the infected premise, so where the infected trees are. That's based on science that demonstrates that that's the farthest distance that the known beetle vectors of oak wilt in Canada can fly. As we develop additional response plans, it'll all depend on the detection and working with the city and the landscape. There are a few pieces of information on what CFIA does when a new detection has been made within the response framework. It's called an analysis of the incursion. So if you're interested, you can take a look at that section, and that may help each individual get a better idea of what will happen in their city.
Awesome, good to know. Can the roots of other tree species be carriers or transmitters of the disease?
No, this is specific to oaks.
Is this a hard stop on deadwood pruning as well? How can we best manage storm tear-outs and hazardous limb removal?
I might let Sharon handle that, but my initial answer is if the tree is already dead, it's not attractive to the insect vectors. So cutting down dead trees is not an active way of spreading oak wilt. However, if you suspect the tree has died from oak wilt, please contact the Canadian Food Inspection Agency.
Yeah, I would just confirm, as long as, the tree's been dead long enough that it's not producing pressure pads, then that risk is gone.
Awesome. This person has a question. What is a pressure pad, since you mentioned it? So could you just expand on what that is?
Okay, sorry about that. So this fungus, one of the, for me, this is a cool aspect of this fungus, is that it produces a fungal mat on the surface of the sapwood of the tree. And part of that is this thick, kind of tough pressure pad that actually it's able to produce enough pressure that it actually pushes the bark away from the wood of the tree, which results in the cracking and lets the beetles come down and feed on and crawl over this sweet smelling fungus that they're attracted to. So ecologically, it's a very cool interaction.
I might just note that your initial slides actually had a great picture of that pressure pad, that fungal mat. And if you're able to still share your screen, we could probably point that out to the individuals. As well, the Invasive Species Center and Canadian Food Inspection Agency and quite a few other resources do have images of this.
Thanks, Nicole. Yeah, that's a great idea. Can you see my screen here? Awesome. So this is the pressure pad right here, this raised area in the fungal mat. Okay, so the next question here, as a landscape architect and designer, should we stop planting all oaks or just red oaks?
My initial answer is that CFA is not, as long as it is not a location that has oak wilt, we're not recommending against planting red oaks. The backyard that has the infected trees, we don't recommend that you put a red oak in the ground there, but red oaks are native to Ontario. So we're not recommending against doing that. I might lean on Charlie here as the city forester and certified arborist to add any additional information.
Thanks, Nicole. Yeah, if you're in an area with oak wilt, I would definitely advise against planting red oaks for a time being until it's under control, at least. There is other options that you could plant. You could go with multiple other things that would thrive in your area, but I wouldn't necessarily start planting red oaks immediately after having an oak wilt infestation or infection in your area. Maybe give it a few years. 5 years, see if it's under control, and if it has been eradicated, then start planting again.
Yeah, I would just stress to remember that, this is a really slow moving disease, but, through natural spread, and that in the States, they have been dealing with oak wilt from the 1940s, at least, if not longer. They still have many oaks. I also wanted to point out that one of the reasons we don't suggest planting oaks back again immediately after an oak wilt infection is because it takes a while for the root systems of the infected trees to actually die. So even though the above ground part of the tree has died, the root system below ground can live for at least 3 years still. So that would be one of the reasons not to, just immediately go back and replant an oak.
Makes sense. Thanks all so much. So this person here, the 2 locations where oak wilt has been found are quite far apart. Is it expected that more oak wilt will be found in areas far from either of these locations?
The CFIA has annual surveys for oak wilt throughout Ontario and in Canada as a whole. And many of our areas have been focusing on those that we consider high risk. So nearby the US infestations and in areas where people are likely to move firewood or mills or other wood processing facilities that import oak products from the United States. Our surveys are quite intensive and successful. And thus far, aside from these 2 detections, we haven't detected oak wilt. With our delimitation survey, we're also moving around some survey locations to ensure that we're covering off areas, between Niagara Falls and Springwater, and a few areas nearby that people are likely to have moved firewood, so campgrounds or high, like cottage areas, that kind of thing. I don't like to think too much on where additional populations could or could not pop up. I think that's a little negative. However, we're using risk analysis to ensure that we are surveying the most at-risk places at this point.
Sounds good, thank you. And Nicole, another question for you here. How long will CFIA continue to test for oak wilt rather than just visually confirming it? Do you anticipate the testing capacity of the lab to be overwhelmed initially, leading to delays in confirmation and extending infection windows?
So for the Canadian Food Inspection Agency to declare a place eradicated of a pest, we need 5 years of negative survey data. We have spoken with our lab and they are prepared for additional samples to come in, especially considering that we now have this additional detection. Results on oak wilt samples can take 12 to 14 days. And at this point, our lab hasn't indicated that they'll need additional time.
Good to know, thank you. This person here is commenting on wound coverings. So instead of using paint on a wound, I've heard that orange oil and beeswax is effective. A natural option doesn't encourage rot, but is to be applied annually. Do you have any thoughts on this? Have you used this in the field at all?
I have not used that, and I haven't seen any research papers that have shown it to be an effective method, so it's not something that I could suggest.
Good to know. Let's see here. If we find a dead red oak along our right-of-way, should we be contacting CFIA to inspect regardless of whether oak wilt has been identified in the area?
If you find a dead red oak and you do see signs of bark cracks, you can contact CFIA to follow up. I would recommend that if you see a red oak that is dead, take a look to see if there are other things that could have killed it first. We had that huge storm last year. There has been drought. Take a look at the other trees in the area before assuming that it is oak wilt. But CFIA does follow up on all the reports that we get. We do recommend that if you're sending reports to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, you include images of the whole tree, some suspect areas that might have bark cracks, and if possible, any leaves that have, that distinct browning pattern starting from the leaf tips that make its way down to the base of the leaf.
Awesome, good to know. Are there any species of oak showing resistance to oak wilt that should be prioritized in planting or restoration efforts?
So, so trees in the red oak group are the most susceptible. And I've not heard of any particular type of species in the red oak group that is less susceptible than the others. Trees in the white oak group, like a bur oak or a white oak, they still can get white oak. They're more likely to get branch dieback. They can die from oak wilt. So just in general, there's no oak tree that is not susceptible to it, but they vary in their response to oak wilt.
Good to know, thank you. I'm just looking at some questions here. Can you use depletion trapping of the vector nidatulids around these invasion sites to limit potential spread of the pathogen? Anybody know?
So right now trapping of the beetles is only being done for research purposes. There has been some research to look at beetle trapping as a biosurveillance tool, but that's not currently the practice.
I think we mentioned it earlier, but what is the travel distance of the beetle? How far can it fly?
I can start by saying that CFIA is using the furthest distance that beetles have been recorded to fly to help inform our surveys. So the research that we have indicates that they can fly at most 1.6 kilometers. But Sharon's done more research on the beetles than I have, so perhaps if she has some additional information on that.
I don't have anything that is specific, Nicole.
Okay. Should all of Ontario, especially in the southwestern area, implement the no pruning season immediately?
I am an optimist at heart, so I would say yes, please, to reduce any risk. It can give you peace of mind. We had these 2 detections in areas that, weren't as close to known infestations in the United States. And so out of an abundance of caution, we do recommend that you take all of the suggestions that we're providing today and only do some of these pruning activities during the no risk period.
Good. Nicole, I think this question will be for you. Do you have any information that you could provide on the spring water find? Any details on like how many trees, how it was detected, and what's being done there?
Yep, I can say what I can to still protect the confidentiality of the homeowner. So this report came directly to the local Canadian Food Inspection Agency office in Barrie, and it was a single tree that they were concerned about. The signs that it was exhibiting was the leaf browning from the crown down.
Okay. So should we be just avoiding the movement of firewood spread, movement of just oak trees, or is it all species of trees?
The Canadian Food Inspection Agency's most used motto, I would say, in the plant health world is burn it where you buy it, don't move firewood. There are so many things that can be spread through the movement of firewood. So we strongly ask that you do not move firewood of any species, to clarify.
Yes, good advice. I think maybe the last question we'll do here. Can mycorrhizae spread oak wilt in the ground around trees? Has there been any research into that?
Can you repeat that one more time?
Yeah, can mycorrhizae spread oak wilt in the ground around trees?
So no, the fungus only travels through the tissues of the tree, through the vascular system. That's where the water and food transport occurs. So no, it does not move through mycorrhizae.
Yeah, thanks for the pronunciation there. Okay, well, there was a lot of questions here. Thank you all for submitting your questions and for listening, and for our speakers for being here. We really appreciate it. Yeah, like I said, there was a lot of questions, so we weren't able to get through them all, but you can always email us at info@invasivespeciescenter.ca, and we can try to answer them ourselves, or we can direct you to somebody who can. So thank you again for attending the webinar, and thank you to our speakers. We appreciate your time. Everybody have a great rest of your day. Bye.